Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Sakamoto, Interim Director of Programming and Director of Asian and Asian American Arts and Culture at the UMass Fine Arts Center. We begin this broadcast by acknowledging that the University of Massachusetts Amherst stands on traditional Nonotuck land, and we recognize our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohican and the Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. We further acknowledge, based on language courtesy of Groundwater Arts, that this evening's broadcast platform, YouTube, is headquartered in what is now called San Bruno, California, on the traditional lands of the Ohlone and Tamian peoples. This semester, the Fine Arts Center presents over 40 virtual performances, artist talks, exhibitions, and special events for students, the UMass and Five College community, and the general public, all free or low priced. Check out fineartscenter.com. We'd also like to thank our media sponsors, the Daily Hampshire Gazette and New England Public Media, and our Spring 2021 season sponsor, Coca-Cola. The UMass Fine Arts Center is also supported by the New England Foundation for the Arts through the New England Arts Resilience Fund, part of the United States Regional Arts Resilience Fund, an initiative of the U.S. Regional Arts Organization, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, with major funding from the Federal CARES Act of the National Endowment for the Arts. Fine Arts Center remains more committed than ever to UMass students and the Five College community, and our work depends upon gifts to the Fine Arts Center. So if you're able, please consider a donation in support of our public mission at fineartscenter.com/giving. So with formalities aside, we welcome you to tonight's special event, a co-presentation for the first time with the Berklee Institute for Jazz and Gender Justice, an event called Riffing the Reality, Women, Gender, and Jazz, featuring a panel conversation with Terri Lyne Carrington, Tammy Kernodle, and Sarah Elizabeth Charles, as well as musicians of the Berklee Jazz and Gender Justice Institute, and a concert with Terri Lyne Carrington and the musicians of the JGJ Ensemble. Our moderator for the evening is Yvonne Mendez, recently retired from the University of Massachusetts, where she served as our Fine Arts Center Director of Education and Engagement and Director of our Jazz Outreach Program, Valley Jazz Network, tonight's co-presenter. A few examples of the great programs that Yvonne curated during her time here include Jazz Music and Social Change, Cuban Music and Jazz, The Legacy of Max Roach, and many, many others. She is currently working as a consultant in arts and education and media and communication design and management. Yvonne continues to collaborate locally and is working to present unique jazz immersive presentations in the region. So please, without further ado, welcome Yvonne Mendez.
Got to turn on the mic first. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to this really great event. My name's Yvonne Mendez, as Michael. Thank you for that great introduction. I wanted to give a little background as to how this event actually started and give some kudos to the Valley Jazz Network Committee. So the committee is comprised of these really wonderful folks: Lee Hines, Arlene Avakian, Jason Robinson, Daryl Harper, and Catherine Jensen Hall. I want to thank them because they were the brain children of this event tonight. We sit around and we talk about what those really great things are, those trends in jazz that we want to shed a little more light on. And women, gender, and jazz was one of the topics that came up. We had a lively conversation about, well, do we want to focus on women as women musicians or just focus on their work as musicians? And so this came together as a way to shed light more actually on the dynamics of gender in the jazz field. And so we have a really great panel. We have a great evening happening. We're going to do some talking, some conversation first, and then we're going to move into a pre-recorded concert with some of the students from the Berklee Jazz Gender Justice Institute and Terri Lyne Carrington. So I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. Tammy Kernodle is an internationally recognized scholar and musician that teaches and researches in the areas of African American music and gender. She's worked closely with a number of educational programs, including the American Jazz Museum, the National Museum of American History and Culture, NPR, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and the BBC. Her works appeared in numerous journals, anthologies, online platforms, and Tammy Kernodle is the author of the biography Soul on Soul, The Life and Music of Mary Lou Williams, which was recently released in a new second edition. She has appeared in a number of award-winning documentaries. If any of you have seen Girls in the Band, Tammy was in that, The Lady Who Swings the Band, and Miles Davis, The Birth of Cool. Dr. Kernodle currently serves as the president of the Society for American Music and is professor of musicology at Miami University. Terri Lyne Carrington has been here a few times. I love it when she comes. She was here for our event on the legacy of Max Roach. And Terri, of course, is a 3-time Grammy Award-winning drummer, producer, educator, and activist. Started her professional career while studying under a full scholarship at the Berklee College of Music in Boston, where she currently works. She was really in demand in the mid-'80s. She worked as a drummer in New York before gaining national recognition on late night TV as the house drummer for both the Arsenio Hall Show and Quincy Jones's Vibe TV show. To date, Terri Carrington has performed on over 100 recordings, has worked extensively with so many artists, including Al Jarreau, Stan Getz, Woody Shaw, Cassandra Wilson, Diane Reeves, the Yellow Jackets. She's done a really wonderful program with Esperanza Spalding and Jerry Allen, and many more. Ms. Carrington is an honorary doctorate recipient from Berklee and currently serves as founder and artistic director for the Berklee Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice. Ms. Carrington was granted the Doris Duke Award in 2019 and the 2021 NEA Jazz Masters Award in recognition of her past and ongoing contributions to jazz music. And her current band project is Terri Lyne Carrington and Social Science, a collaboration with Aaron Parks and Matthew Stevens. They released their debut album, Waiting Game, in November of 2019. Terri is accompanied by 2 of students from the Jazz and Gender Justice Institute, Devin and Stephen, and you'll meet them as well. They will speak on the panel as well. Sarah Elizabeth Charles is a vocalist and composer based in New York City and has worked and studied with such artists as Christian Scott, George Cables, Jerry Allen, and Sheila Jordan. She's released 3 critically acclaimed albums with her band Scope between 2012 and today. Even though this is a virtual event, Sarah actually has been here in person before, just like Terri Lyne. Sarah Elizabeth Charles came and performed with Christian Scott's band for the Jazz Music and Social Change event we did a few years back. She's an active vocalist in a number of bands and has performed in many venues throughout her career, including the White House, Carnegie Hall, the first annual Culture Summit in Abu Dhabi, the Kennedy Center, the Rose Theater with Jazz at Lincoln Center, and many more. She has also had a commissioned composition performed at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. via the Canales Project Hear Her Song Initiative. She's also an active educator and an activist. She works as a teaching artist with Carnegie Hall's Sing Sing Correctional Facility and Future Music Project Youth Workshops, and is an adjunct professor at the New School for Jazz and Contemporary Music, teaching a course she designed called Jazz and Gender. In 2020, she was selected to be one of the 5 members of the Joe's Pub Working Group, a recipient of the New York City Women's Fund. At this time, I'd like to introduce or bring in all of the panelists. Hey, so nice to see your lovely faces. Hey, welcome.
Good to see you.
Yeah. So Tammy, tell us a little bit about the work you've done and how it has influenced the work in creating a new climate for jazz and gender.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you, Yvonne, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, which with such a stellar guest list. So I'm going to try to rise to the occasion tonight in the midst of all of this brilliance and greatness.
You're one of the stars.
Oh, I don't know about that. But my work as a historian, as a teacher, has focused on expanding our canonical discussion about jazz. Jazz, in terms of its historical perspectives, has in many ways mirrored what we've seen happen to Western European classical music, where there are these kind of great men who are oftentimes situated as the anchor points for us understanding what has been the evolution of this history. And so my work is calling for and challenging that, but also asking that there's an expansion of the theoretical and analytical lens that we use in our scripting of jazz history to consider who were the women who were playing and composing and alongside of many of these men. And in many cases, especially in the case of a Mary Lou Williams, a Blanche Calloway, or a Lovey Austin or Lil Houghton, who were the women who were also mentoring the male performers that were in their milieu or their environment. And so, so I'm looking to not just reclaim these women from the margins of the history, but put their contributions to that history in dialogue with their male peers.
I want to come back to that because I think there's a lot of folks who haven't realized that women were actually mentoring some of these male performers that actually went on to be more famous than the women were.
Yes.
And so there's that disparity. And I'd love to talk about that some more when we come back around to the bigger conversation. Terri Lyne Carrington, how about you?
Thank you for inviting me as well, and for giving this opportunity to our students to be able to have this virtual performance. It was a lot of fun putting it together. And yeah, thank you for just creating this kind of space and for always being so supportive, Yvonne, and your programming at UMass, has been stellar over the years. Yeah. So, thanks. And also just, I agree with Tammy, this is a really incredible cast of people. And I always say I'm not a scholar. So being on this call with, people that are, it's always a pleasure, for me. And I always learn something. So I just want to say that I appreciate the work that Tammy is doing, the work that Sarah is doing. And I also appreciate the work and the perspective of our students, because I learn from them as well. Devin and Stephen are great and very smart. So yes, you had asked about the Institute, and I really came to focus on this later in my career, closer to 50. And I think, everything happens in its own time. And I'm not, I'm not saying that it should have happened earlier, but part of me feels like it should have happened earlier. But one day I was speaking to some students, Women in Jazz Collective at Berklee, and they were telling me stories. And finally a light bulb went off, and I felt like, the very least I could do was try to create a space at the college that I worked at, where, they felt welcomed, nurtured, where they could be their authentic selves. And, I just grew from there, from that desire to create that space. And I'm still going. The one thing, that happened that I didn't expect, at least not so quickly, was how many young men wanted to participate in our institute. And I soon realized how patriarchy has affected not just women. I hadn't really thought about that before, but how many young men do not want to necessarily have to perform masculinity, or necessarily be in a toxic masculine environment. And so that was something that we focused on, in understanding that gender justice won't happen, unless everybody invests in this, and that the potential of the music won't fully reach its potential either. And so when I talk to my male colleagues, I often, talk to them really with that in mind. If you care about this music, then you would really care about gender justice as much as you care about racial justice or any other injustices that we're faced with. So that's kind of the beginning and how it started. And we're doing a lot of different things. We have ensembles, some classes at the college, and we're also doing, I guess, what would be called some corrective work with our newest project, latest project, the one that's, keeping myself and Devin and others up later at night. And it's a collection of lead sheets, 100 lead sheets by women composers, because women, as Tammy mentioned, have been left out of the canon and have, not gotten their props. So this book will feature 100 women composers. So we're feverishly working on that now.
What's your timeline on the book?
I hate to put it out there because then I'll really be stuck to it.
I know. I'm sorry I asked
No,
that.
no, I'm going to, though, because that's good. We're trying to get it out in January.
Oh, awesome.
So,
well, yeah. I'm a big advocate. I'll pass it along. I just want to make it available to people. So everyone who's here, when that comes out and it hits the ground, I mean, it's a big deal. I feel like it's a big deal, being someone who's been in classrooms, listening to students play all male composers. It'll be really wonderful. It's a really wonderful, will make a difference in the landscape of jazz, most definitely. So thank you so much for that. I want to turn to the students because, thank you for talking about the student voices, because it's very important to me to have students be at the table sharing their knowledge and information. Because, of course, I mean, it sounds kind of corny, but, they're the future of the genre, and so I'm happy to welcome Stephen and Devin. For a few minutes, just tell us a little bit about your experience. And I think last time I wasn't pushing you all to be activists, but I did talk about activism. So go ahead.
Go ahead, Devin, if you'd like.
Certainly. Well, I'm sure Stephen will echo this, but it's just incredible to be among you all. I look up to each of you so much. And it's really one of those things that you have to take a step back and really appreciate and be grateful for. Especially, as someone who, like a lot of people, we're definitely on the precipice of whether or not, jazz in general was right for me. Up until the very last second, had it not been for a lot of key people that believed in me. And I feel like that's one of the things that's most important about, talking about these issues and making sure that this is something that's talked about in general. It's very hard to believe in yourself if you don't see that reflected back at you. And yeah, that's just something that really gets to me when I think about it, where I am right now compared to, even a year ago or the year before that. But yeah, I've been a student at the Institute for about 4 semesters now. And it's been really incredible, the education I've been able to receive, both academically, learning the language to articulate these experiences that I've had throughout my life, like, imposter syndrome, culture of dissemblance, intersubjectivity, all of these incredible terms that have been mind-boggling for me and opened a lot of doors. But also experientially, just getting to learn from the stories of, people like Professor Carrington and all of the guest artists that we have, and our faculty, and especially the experience of getting to have a community of other non-male identifying musicians has been really incredible after, an entire, up until that point of coming to the Institute and having an all-female ensemble, and with a female instructor that that had never happened for me before. I'd always been the only one. So it's really great to know that I'm not. Yeah. Stephen, if you want to jump in.
Absolutely. I really appreciate everything you were saying, and I also just want to start by saying a huge thank you to both Terri Lyne and Yvonne for having me involved. It's an incredible opportunity to be able to share a platform with so.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that. I think I've been involved in the Institute. I was really lucky to kind of time it perfectly where I got to Berklee right as the Institute was starting. Which has really just been an incredible conversation to see the transformation that has happened in the atmosphere of a lot of the communities at the college, where as these conversations are being had and as this collective consciousness is being raised to more awareness over what has been going on through the entire history of this music, it really is transformational in terms of the ability for people to understand these things, for the ability for people to feel confident and collected and empowered in their environment and in their art. I know that this institute has had a absolutely irrevocable, and it's really, really hard to overstate how much of an impact this institute has had on me personally and for so many other people, because in many places, these conversations about recognizing these things that are happening in this music and in the history are just not had anywhere. And even conversations about things like gender are not have in any circles on a lot of these academic levels, especially in jazz music. So the fact that this is somewhere that these conversations are being had on such a high level, and these spaces are being created for students to come in and really get to explore all of these different aspects of ourselves and be able to put that into the music and be able to look at the history and say, okay, why is the story being told the way that it's being told? And anyway, yeah, I'm just really, really grateful to be part of the Institute. And yeah.
Wow, that sounds so powerful. I'm sure, like creating that environment where you feel powerful, and you feel supported and full and able to actually express yourself without feeling that you're lesser than, that's wonderful.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
I love it.
it's really incredible.
Yeah. And our final panelist, Sarah Elizabeth Charles, it's great to see you.
Great to be here. I'm taking a big sighs over here as I'm listening to everyone. Devin and Stephen, thank you for sharing so openly. Yeah, this is a lot, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm humbled and honored for so many different reasons. One of which is that I've been covering Tammy and Terri Lyne in my class, in my jazz and gender class, for 4 years now. And this is the first kind of time or couple of months Terri Lyne and I have kind of interacted in a few of these spaces. This is Tammy and my first time interacting in this sort of conversation in space. So I'm just really grateful. I entered into this sort of conversation in this world, this gender studies / creative music world about 5 years ago, when the dean of the new school asked me to design a class called Women in Jazz. And I remember that lunch and kind of leaving with a funny feeling inside of me that didn't quite feel aligned. And I reflected a little bit, and then we met again. And I realized after that I really wasn't interested in teaching a class on women in jazz, that I really wanted to broaden the scope and teach a class on jazz and gender and jazz. And that felt like an appropriate title for the course. And so I broadened that scope. The dean allowed me to broaden that scope and kind of just run with it, which I'm grateful for, and really created this curriculum that I now co-teach with an amazing fellow musician, Caroline Davis, that really centers on challenging the established norms and the erasure practices that Tammy alluded to earlier that have existed in the patriarchal structure of this music. What the Institute is also trying and successfully challenging on a day-to-day basis with the students, as you just heard, in such a powerful way. This sort of zoomed out version or approach or broadened scope approach really has allowed, in my experience, for these conversations to dissect the root of gender and cultural norms, or the gender and cultural norms that have been established, in the world of jazz and Black American music, and then also broaden the scope and draw parallels to the world at large as well. And that has been kind of indispensable. You know, the course is sort of a history course. It's also a self-improvement, self-reflection invitation, a sociology course. We have a whole section on civil rights that we cover, because we're really just trying to draw the parallels, because, you know, these issues around perceptions of gender, identity, sexual orientation, you know, really taking an intersectional approach and broadening to talk about also race and class and age and all of these other elements that factor into each of our identities, and that also factor into this established culture of marginalization that's been created in our society, is just like, has been really a really cool opportunity. And the Institute, I remember when I first started teaching the class, and I thought, you know, this course should really be like 5 courses. And then, you know, within a year, I had brought Asia Burrell Wood, who's the managing director of the Institute, in as a guest in that first semester to the class. And we had many conversations. And then all of a sudden it was like the Institute was happening at the same time. So it's been really interesting how all of these conversations have been percolating in different spaces. And sort of my dream of like, oh, this course should be 5 courses. And then like the Institute exists now, which is beautiful because there's more than 5 courses. And it's just exciting that these types of conversations, I should say, are really finding their way to the forefront and challenging the norms. And just, we'll get to personal stuff, but I just wanted, because Devin and Stephen, you shared so honestly. So I just wanted to say that in terms of my own process of like learning and dissection, you know, because I don't just ask like my students or people at events when I moderate to do this, I really have tried to incorporate it into my own life. And this sort of interrogation of my own inherent bias, as well as the interrogation of, you know, Yvonne and I have spoken about this a little bit of gender and my perception of it generally, has really been, it's really been a life-changing experience for me. You know, we say as teachers that, like, you know, the best teachers are the people who are learning along with their students. And sometimes I think, you know, I might be learning more from them than they're learning from me. You know, I feel like it's just an exchange, and there's such an openness that I feel that so many people are bringing to this conversation that I've learned from both my students and my colleagues and continue to learn. And I'm really grateful for that new approach, because it's really been able to find its way into all sorts of parts of my life that, again, I'll pause here, but because we'll get into it, but I'm excited to talk about that too. And I appreciate, again, Devin and Stephen, you being so vulnerable and already in this conversation and sharing your experience. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Well, let's open it up to conversing. I want to jump in with one initial thought about something that Sarah said, which is that word intersectionality. And so, you know, intersectionality, like where we're living right now with protests and people, you know, shedding a spotlight on systemic racism in our communities. But intersectionality is something that I feel has always, or hopefully has always been a part of jazz. I feel like that whole idea about there being overlapping and exchange, you know, has been a part of the music itself, but it's not reflected in the culture of what the dynamics of gender with jazz in jazz music. And like kind of what Terri said about like dealing with equity in jazz is about raising the bar and making jazz music even better than it was before. And I feel like there's, even in society, you know, thinking through this intersectionality, people are resistant. You know, people are resistant to like making that change, even though things will be so much better, right? There's so much, you know, flavor. It's like making a beautiful soup, and you know, if it's just broth by itself and there's nothing else in it, it's not good, right? So I enjoyed your comments about that particular thing. I also wanted to backtrack a little bit to what Tammy was talking about early on about a historical perspective of women and gender in jazz. And I was not surprised, but when you mentioned that women were actually mentoring many male performers, and a lot of people don't know that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think we can see that in the earliest recorded history of jazz. We go back to Chicago in the 1920s and we look at the women who were part of that soundscape and part of that community, that a Joe King Oliver, that a Louis Armstrong, that all of these musicians who were migrating from New Orleans and throughout the South, what they encountered, because by the time that Armstrong is in Chicago, you have Lovey Austin, who is very prevalent on the music scene. He meets Leo Harden, who is already establishing herself as an autonomous sound identity, as a person who's already a part of this very active, music scene that is taking shape on the South Side of Chicago and Bronzeville, right? And so when we listen to a Louis Armstrong, what I ask for my students to do now is instead of just simply teaching Armstrong in relation to his relationship to Joe King Oliver, I asked them to consider, if you set Armstrong in the middle of a street in the middle of Bronzeville, who would he hear and what would he see? Well, it would be Bessie Smith, it would be Ma Rainey, it would be Lovey Austin, as well as Joe King Oliver and Jelly Roll Morton and these other people. And so I'm starting to have conversations, because like when we hear Armstrong sing, Armstrong doesn't start to sing until after these sessions that he has with Bessie Smith, right? He doesn't sing until after he is kind of working with these blues singers, right? And so we need to start to hear those things in his voice, in the same way that when we get to the 1940s and we listen to a Dizzy Gillespie, or we listen to a Thelonious Monk in particular, and we need to be able to hear the imprint of a Mary Lou Williams, who Monk came to her apartment every single day, sometimes several times a day, and played the same compositions over and over again, you know, trying to get Mary Lou's critique and her insight on that, right? And so I think, that kind of level of mentorship we have to begin to talk about, because the history and the journalism on jazz has assumed that these things have been created in isolation, great men working together. But there was men that were engaging in very robust, very diverse communities, right? But I also want to say on the gender piece, because what I noticed, even though my work is focused on, bringing women into this conversation, and that started because I sat in classrooms and wondered why why we weren't talking about certain people. Like, why don't we talk about Blanche Calloway in relation to her brother Cab Calloway, right? Because she was working on the scene and helped him launch his career, right? Why are we not talking about that? But I think also when we talk about gender, we have to talk about the erasure of queer people within this context. Like, we're only now starting to reclaim Billy Strayhorn out of the shadow of Duke Ellington. Why did that happen for so long? We still haven't reclaimed Cecil Taylor. We there are these other parts of this narrative that frame identity and gender and sexuality and all of these things that in some ways meant that people were pushed out of these historical narratives, even though when you look at how they operated in those grassroots music scenes, they were important voices, right? And so I do think that that work for me as a historian has to expand. I'm starting to ask those questions as well, and not just in relation to jazz, but in every form of music that I'm talking about, because students are looking for a way to identify with this historical past and try to make it make sense with their present state, their identity within the music itself. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all that information, I'm like humbled. But it's all great. I mean, it's true. It's like if you don't know what's happened in the past, like it's, the mistakes will carry over, but also there's nuggets and beautiful information that has happened that will flourish through this time where things are changing so much. To talk about like different the fluidity of gender now, and how the society is really changing.
And I think it's who speaks to the history, because for so long white male critics were centralized as the voices shaping the commentary and downbeat and jazz times and metronome and melody maker. And so, it's not that the musicians themselves always, promoted these policies of exclusion or whatever, but we have to look at the larger infrastructure and ask ourselves, who were the decision makers? Who were the people who were really in some ways trying to have ownership over something that they weren't even really fully participating in? And so they could dismiss a Hazel Scott or someone who didn't fit into their particular paradigm, when many of them didn't play one instrument, didn't sing one note, yet they felt that they could operate in this authoritarian role, right? And so I ask for my students to go back and look at these things. Who's writing? Who's speaking? Who's shaping the narrative? And what are the positives in that? But what are also the negatives that are mirrored in that?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Amen.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Because that whole idea of ownership, the decision makers, even the producers, Zakai Curtis, we're going to have, he's coming next in April, I think the end of April, for our jazz festival. But, like he's got his own record label, and it's one of the things that I see about him as far as the business aspect of it. He's got his own record label and he can make those decisions, right, himself. And I wanted to also ask all of you about the idea of band leaders. Like at the same time. I mean, I brought up producers, but also band leaders. Like female band leaders. Are making a difference. Terry, I see you shaking your head. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, what's been said, because you're right. I mean, you said producers, and you talked about journalists, also record company executives, label owners, have they controlled the narrative for a long time about who became jazz famous, so to say. Who got a record deal. That was your big goal. So one of the incredible things now is how independent artists have emerged, and because record labels are record labels are kind of a thing of the past. So now we don't have the same gatekeepers that we used to have, and so it's allowing a lot more voices to be heard, which I think is making jazz really fertile right now. So band leaders, of course, too. But even if you were a band leader, I mean, I was told when I did the Mosaic project that I wasn't a band leader. I did the record, it was finished, and everybody passed except Concord. Everyone, Blue Note, Verve, everybody passed on. So actually, when they won a Grammy, that was one of the first thoughts that went through my head. I was like, they're eating some crow now. But so I think, my point is they didn't see me as a leader. They said, well, drummers aren't leaders. But then you think, well, what about, Art Blakey and Elvin Jones and Roy Haynes and all the drummers that were leaders? But, the undercurrent tone was, women drummers aren't leaders. And then I looked at the history of a label like Blue Note, and there just weren't a lot of women leaders that weren't vocalists that were signed to that label. So that's when, for me, I started doing the math and really seeing, like, people might say things like that, like, like what people don't call women geniuses as often as they call men geniuses. Labels aren't signing, women instrumentalists. like they'd rather sign a marginal male instrumentalist than sign a great woman instrumentalist. And I didn't really believe in all that. I thought a lot of people were, conspiracy theorists, and I wasn't looking deeply enough. But people would say things like that to me, and I just kept working. You know what I mean? But then I really started looking at this stuff, and I think for me, just to have kept working and not really dealing with this was good. Worked for me at the time because it got me to where I needed to be. Because if I had thought about all this stuff so early, it might have stifled, some of my growth. I really do, though, appreciate Tammy mentioning that it wasn't always just, the men that determined this, and it was, these other structures around that, which is true. But just like myself, I'm not cutting any slack for the men, just like I'm not cutting it for myself for not stepping up, for not challenging this. I didn't do it either. So I'm like, yeah, so I'm doing it now. So I'm asking you to do it now too. I think right now we're seeing, especially this past year with having a bit of a pause with our daily rat race, we're really seeing things, I think, from a different perspective in some way, of course, there's obvious ways and obvious things that have happened, but I think that at least for me, even as busy as I am at home, I'm able to look at things a little differently, and I'm able to look at how I've participated, in these, oppressive structures, and also like how we can't keep replicating it, even if we're doing it, how like we don't know that we're doing it, but we are. So, I was listening to a speech of Ella Baker's where she talked about that, and really opened my eyes to look at how I've benefited and participated, in these oppressive structures. And so I'm, trying to take a deep look within. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Can I chime in?
I saw you shaking your head. I was like, go, Sarah, go.
There's so much. No, one thing that's coming up though, in relationship to your leaders question or your leader question, just thinking about who we're used to seeing in positions of power, right? Who is it in society that has the most power, that has the most control? What does the hierarchy look like in this patriarchal society that we're all moving through and existing in, and that we've all come up in? And I think that, part of the inherent bias conversation that I so appreciate is sort of acknowledging that none of us can get away from it because we've all come up in it, because it's everywhere. It permeates everything. So we kind of like all have our own unlearning to do. I've had my own unlearning to do, and relearning and recalibrating and reflection for sure. But Tammy, you mentioned Louis Armstrong earlier and Hazel Scott, and it made me think like, wait, but Hot Five, that was Lil Hardin's band. That wasn't Louis' band to start with. And in relationship to Hazel Scott, there were so many. Hazel Scott was the first Black American person with a television show, with a network television show, and it was interesting how Hazel's career was dismantled because it was the House Un-American Activities Committee that ended up really, dismantling, of course, in connection with the network and network execs who were most likely white men at the time, who pulled her show and basically ruined her career, that she was never able to quite come back from that, and she moved out of the country. So it's really interesting how these people in positions of power, even outside of the music world, have had their hands in this space and in creating and cultivating and perpetuating these systems of power. And what's something that stands out to me too is this idea that like people from outside of the music, I think it was something that you mentioned, Terri Lyne and Tammy, this idea that people from outside of the music can have their hands in and can potentially have a say in what happens within the it's a little bit of a scary concept and a little bit of a sad idea for me to reflect on. And I haven't quite ever heard it put exactly that way, even though I've been very, very aware, hyper aware, especially in recent years, of that reality. And one thing that's encouraging to me is that this idea of like taking a Black feminist approach to dismantling, right? So like collaboration, right? All of these things that are kind of like anti-patriarchal. So collaborating with each other, having these conversations, self-reflection, not being able to point to a hero or not being able to point to one individual who is the archetype of the movement. It's like, no, we're all the movement. We're all having this conversation. There's no hierarchy, even here amongst the students and the participants, all of us, we're just here as human beings having a conversation. Yeah, I think that for me too, as a band leader, to circle back to your conversation, Yvonne, that has been almost one of the most revolutionary personal things that I can participate in as a result of the work that I've done on myself and the things that I've been learning over the past 5 years and digging into in a deeper way. How can I, in my creative space, in my creative environment, challenge myself to bring Black feminist ideology in and practice into everything that I do? And it's interesting because that idea and that question, to me, the more and more I dig into it, is not about being a Black woman. We can all do it. We all need to adopt it. This ideology is like so valuable to, I think, this forward movement that we're trying to make as human beings.
Wow.
Can I ask a question of
Sure.
Sarah? Because Sarah, I'm very interested in, and first of all, I'm so excited to meet you. And so I was wondering, do you find as a singer that it's hard sometimes for people to conceptualize you as a composer? Because I think, when we speak of composers, a lot of times it's very instrumental centric, and sometimes, singers are not necessarily seen in that historical gaze. And so I was just wondering, do you find that you are fighting on many different levels, for people to kind of get a full sense of who you are?
I appreciate that question a lot. I think a lot of singers, a lot of vocalists do face that. I think that for me, I kind of decided early on that I was going to be performing and focusing on original music. I was 18 when I found my band. So we've been together for a long time and playing my music for a long time, and we went a long time with no gigs and not really doing anything and no records. And I kind of had I reached a fork in the road. I was still in school. Obviously, I was still learning the tradition. I was still shedding. But in terms of my time outside of the classroom, I was really spending my time like rehearsing my band and writing my music, my original music. So I sort of decided to go that route pretty early on, which meant many years without work. And then also finally meant sort of a solidification as to like, okay, wait, this is what Sarah does, and this is who Sarah is, and this is what, so it's sort of, I think that's sort of just how people I think the trajectory of my career has been such that that's sort of just how people recognize what I do anyway. So there's sort of this, you'd have to ask people, I guess, but that's my perception of it, that okay, Sarah, original music, okay, those two go together, vocalist, musician, okay, cool, that those two go together. But I find that for many of my peers, and I've talked to peers about it who happen to be vocalists and also who happen to be cisgender female musicians, who start off by maybe singing more standard repertoire, arrangements of standards, more straight ahead gigs, who start off on that other path that I kind of was like, oh, I really want to go there, but this is pulling me, and I ended up going here. That later on, if they end up writing their own material, that they are taken less seriously as composers. I will find oftentimes that they'll say that I'm a songwriter, like a singer-songwriter, as opposed to a composer, which to me, I'm like, whatever, I write songs. Okay, cool. I don't know what that means to you in relationship to like composer. It feels like a more grand term than songwriter, but I consider myself to be both. I appreciate that question a lot. And I think it's important.
Yeah, I wanted to spend time talking a little bit as well about that instrumentalist versus vocalist as far as gender is concerned. I want to, we're headed towards the end of this part before the concert. So I really wanted to give Devin and Stephen a chance to answer a couple of questions. One of the things that you both talked about was mentorship and belonging. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about your experience with that as well. If you have time, you can do them both or you can pick one. But I also am curious about what you feel the future of jazz is and how you fit into that future.
Well, it's interesting. When you were speaking about the, instrumentalist vocalist tension, I am someone who tries to do both. I try to sing and play bass. And that's been a really interesting experience throughout the years because...
You're a bass player?
Yes, ma'am.
That's cool.
Yeah. So as someone who has been in both situations and goes through both situations and sometimes does them simultaneously, it's very interesting to see the parallels between people's perception of me when I do either and what people clearly want me to do in certain situations and are upset that I'm not doing in other ones. And it's been a process of, I guess it relates to that belonging piece of trying to find communities where I don't feel like I have to perform or present myself as one or the other, or choose, or feel tokenized for looking like Esperanza Spalding or whatever.
Well, I was gonna say, oh, you play bass, that's a male instrument.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. I pull up to the gig and they're like, "Can you play
that? Can you carry it?
Yeah. People definitely have, taken my bass and taken it from me to
And said it's not yours, right? Or they've got to carry it for you.
Yeah. Anyway, so that divide is definitely there, that tension, and that's what makes me excited about the future of jazz and this greater, pluralism and just people being able to not have to stay in a box as much. And that's what's been really exciting about getting to expand my horizons. And
that's great.
Institute.
Well, thank you. Stephen, I'm curious.
Yeah, well, this is such incredible conversation. And one question that kind of popped up to me that I think is so interesting to kind of think about in relation to everything that you were saying, is in any given environment, what do we have to do to feel like we belong? Like what do we have to perform? What roles do we have to take? What things do we have to lean into? And like Devin was saying, certain environments, in order to feel accepted by people's expectations, you might be more pressured to take on the role of a vocalist versus a bass player, and I think it's kind of recognizing that if we look at a lot of the environments that are taking place in the jazz world from every step of the ladder, we're going to look all the way down at like middle school to high school to college to the competition scene that's going on, to the club scene that's happening, to the places in the country where these things are happening. It's like we start to realize that through editing, through like moving stuff around, we have created this environment where you really have to perform masculinity in order to be accepted in jazz, period. Doesn't matter if you're a woman, doesn't matter if you're a man, doesn't matter what instrument you play, unless you're going to be like a background vocalist or like playing strings behind something, there's like a few exceptions, but like you have to, in order to be accepted in this environment, be able to play high and fast and loud and cut someone off in the middle of a solo and jump on top of this stuff. And like there's this pressure that because we have very specific people, we haven't allowed ourselves to have Mary Lou be the icon. We haven't allowed Lil Hardin to get the credit for the composing and the incredible work that she did in making Louis Armstrong who he was musically and personally. And so we have all of these the legends who fit these particular roles, who are incredible people who often like did incredible work, and nothing to detract from the body of work. But it's like, in order to exist in jazz, you had to embody that specific type of expression. And if your genuine expression, like say that you wanted to explore things in a little bit more of an understated realm, or like that, which is one. That question brings me to another question, which is one that Terri Lyne has asked, and we ask a lot in the Institute, which is, what would jazz sound like if it were outside of the confines of patriarchy? What would jazz sound like if we had people that were growing up and creating the music that they wanted to create, exploring the sounds and the concepts and the ideas and the art that they wanted to explore, where there was not this enforced binary of the way, the traits that you have to put into yourself and your playing? You know, if you want to be a woman or a non-binary person or whatever fitting into the jazz scene, you had to be one of the guys. You know, you can't, you know, and that's said as a compliment. Oh, don't, yeah, no, they're just one of the guys, you know. And it's like, well, why do you have to be one of the guys? You know, like why is that? Why is that something that is a prerequisite in order to take part in this music conversation? And that's something that excites me about the future, is the fact that because we're having these conversations, because there are panels like this that people can tune into, and because there are institutes where we can get together and hang out, and because there are teachers like Sarah and Terri Lyne that are asking these questions of students and creating these environments where we can explore these parts of ourselves, we're going to get to find out. We're going to get to find out what jazz sounds like when it's created outside of the confines of these systems. And that is something that I'm really, really excited for.
This is amazing. I'm just so sorry I have to cut it short at all, but I want to, I'm going to do this like a lightning round. I'm going to read 3 questions that got sent in, and very quickly, if you have a response, please do. And let me tell to the audience, if you had questions, I'm just going to read these. If you're any of the panelists can answer them, and maybe there's a way for us to get to them all. So one question was, what do you feel the sole purpose of jazz provokes in people? The other question was, do you know of any mentorships for young Black women studying jazz right now? I kind of mentioned mentorship before, it was an issue. And then how do you respond when cis men are visibly uncomfortable discussing gender equity in jazz? This is from a woman who said she's often expected to do all the heavy lifting in the conversation. So those are pretty full. I don't know how we're gonna make it through a lightning round with that. I'm happy to take a quick answer for either of them.
Yeah, I'll just say that as far as mentoring, that's what we're trying to do. I've been mentoring for 15 years, mostly men at Berklee, and I'm very excited about trying to mentor more young women. And there's some things down the line that I can't talk about yet, but hopefully we'll have some kind of mentorship program. As far as speaking to cis men, you know, it depends on what day it is. You know, if you have the space in your heart to deal with somebody else that really needs to do more work themselves, then you have that space in your heart, and you talk to them, hopefully lovingly, if they, you know, deserve that. Some days you're not going to be bothered. Some days it's just too much labor, and so I think the thing is the freedom to decide, you know, how you want to approach every situation. And I think, you know, for me, coming to that has been important. And I think that most people already know what the right thing is, and they have to just look within and read and study and do everything else that we're doing. You know, so pointing that out, I think I've pointed that out to a few people, and I think it's worked. You know, they've bought some books that, you know, first they'll ask you what books, but, you know.
They can Google it, right?
If I could quickly add to that, just because I've had the pleasure of being in some gatherings and some conversations around Terri Lyne in specific, and I feel like watching her handle that last question that's asked about, like, how should we respond? Like how do we respond, and how could we respond when it could be cis white men, but it's also just anyone that might not be as well versed in these conversations. Like, what do we respond if someone is uncomfortable or talking in a way that, like, is clearly lacking in terms of what we can have in this conversation? And I feel like every time watching Terri Lyne navigate that situation is literally just a masterclass in how we could all do it, because what I've seen you do, Terri, is just maintain this kind of calm and cool, and maintain this connection to the person where you don't just accuse them. You don't say, hey, you just said something that's wrong, or you know, but instead, like, like just kind of inquiring a little bit more and asking a few more questions about like, oh, why is this going on? Or bringing the conversation to someone else who can then elaborate. But having that like from a starting point of compassion and realizing that the reason why there's a discomfort there is because this conversation has probably not been had in some of these people's life. And again, this is very much dependent on the day of the week and how much energy you have. But watching that kind of like assuming that someone's on your side and treating them as if they're on your side, I've seen that have the impact of like causing them to act a lot, like be a lot more receptive to doing the learning that they need to do.
I'll add too, just to kind of point to this idea that sometimes it's fatiguing, that reality that it can be fatiguing to have to do that heavy lifting. And, Sherry Tucker talks a little bit about this in her text, Big Ears, this idea that, that sometimes it's okay to not do it. And a colleague of mine who I've learned a lot from having conversations with, and she's guested in our class, and I've been on panel discussions with her. She's a writer and academic. She's studying, she's getting her doctorate in African American Studies at Rutgers University currently. Her name is Naomi Extra, and she talks a lot about sort of this like list of resources that she has and that she just keeps and that she builds upon. And on those days that she's tired, she just passes it along, and she'll share. I've had these conversations a lot. I'm a little fatigued today. I don't have the space like in me or the time to have this conversation, in the nicest way sometimes, or not, as Terri Lyne pointed out, if the person doesn't necessarily deserve it. And she will pass on her list of resources, because I think it's really important for folks to remember that burdening the people who have been marginalized with the educational aspect here is not the vibe. Like that is not, having conversations, being patient, all of that, that's something that we've all had to do. And that's really important. And one thing I appreciate about some things that I've heard Terri Lyne say is that like one-on-one connection, it's like about the one-on-one conversation. Like those are the times that the most impact can be made. And at the same time, it can be fatiguing, and that's cool. And we've all got to make those calls for ourselves. One other just mentorship resource that I didn't want to forget about, the Brooklyn Conservatory of Music, for anybody who's watching, specifically any Black, female, or non-binary identifying individuals who are watching today, the Brooklyn Conservatory of Music is offering a fellowship that they're going to be announcing very soon. And part of that fellowship is going to be mentor opportunities, an opportunity to work with mentors, as well as rehearsal space and performance and composition and all sorts of other things, and monetary. It's a monetary fellowship. So keep your eye out for that. And I can pass along resources to you, Yvonne, so that you can spread it to your community. But anybody who's watching from New York specifically, stay tuned for that fellowship opportunity.
They're scrolling my email address on the screen, which is great. We're out of time for the conversation. It's too bad because, oh my God, like someone wrote, this conversation's on fire. So, but it's been so wonderful. I mean, it was so easy to moderate, actually, this conversation. And there's so many more nuggets of information we didn't get to. I mean, we could just keep talking. There's so many other things I'd love to ask, and I'm sure audience members would like to ask stuff. So folks can email me, and if you guys don't mind, if it's pertinent to you, I'll forward the questions to you, and I'll email the answers to folks who didn't get a chance maybe to answer a question. I'm feeling great. This was so excellent. It was better than I had dreamed it would be. So much information. Thank you so much, Sarah Elizabeth Charles, Devin Gates, Terri Lyne Carrington, Stephen Montecuccio. Did I say that right? I got it? Okay. And Tammy Kernodle. Yes, what a stellar cast. Definitely. And thank you so much for being here. The second part of this evening is a concert. Terry's has a band and performed with the students from the, JGJ Ensemble. I got it. And actually, Stephen and Devin are in the show, which is also really great. Thank you so much, and we'll transition into the performance.
At least we'll pretend like we will.
It's coming. But this was such a great thing. Yeah.
Stop picking on Fascinating rhythm, you got me on the go. Fascinating rhythm, I'm all a quiver. Each morning I get up with the sun. 2 minds at night, no work has been done. I know that once it didn't matter, but now you do it wrong when you start to patter. I'm so unhappy, yeah. Won't you take the day off, decide to run along somewhere far away off and make it snappy? Oh, how I long to be the guy to me. Fascinating rhythm. Fascinating rhythm. Keep picking on me. Fascinating rhythm. Fascinating rhythm. It's true. I love you now and forever. There's nothing that you can do to keep me from loving you. 'Cause my love is unconditional. Seed of my heart, I'm here to help you flourish and grow. Teach you, guide you, teach you everything I know. I wanna help you to see all that you can be. Set your spirit and your mind free. Lord, dear Lord of love, God Almighty, God up above, please look down and see my people through. Oh God, dear God of love, God Almighty, God up above, please look down and see my people through. I believe the sun and moon shine up in the sky. When the day is gray, I know it's clouds passing by. He'll bring peace and comfort to every troubled mind. Come Sunday, oh, come Sunday, that's the day. Often we feel weary, but He knows our every care. Go to Him in secret, He will hear our every prayer. Up from dawn till sunset, we work hard all the day. Come Sunday, oh, come Sunday, that's the day. Please look down. Please look down. Oh, please look down and see my people through.
That was amazing. I was particularly surprised to see Tia Fuller there. She was a Billy Taylor residency artist a few years back, and she came and did a listening party with Valley Jazz Network before I was the coordinator. Just great. But I've been able to meet her. So, I mean, it's amazing that they have these really great artists working all together with those students. So it was a great evening. I want to thank everyone for coming and look forward to, you know, more programming.
And I just want to thank especially Yvonne Mendez. Yvonne has been serving the Fine Arts Center so brilliantly for decades, and we miss you. And this program exemplifies everything great that you do. So thank you. Thank you to the viewers. Thank you, obviously, to all the panelists and the musicians. Quick reminder, we have a couple of really wonderful other performance-based engagement events also coming up. This Saturday at 5 p.m. is our next Bodies at Risk Conversation series event with amazing hip-hop dance artists Rennie Harris, Jackie Miss Funk Lopez, and Dee Sabela Grimes, all led and moderated by the amazing dance studies scholar artist Thomas DeFrance from Duke University. And then next Thursday, March 18th at 7 p.m., our last Bodies at Risks event for the year with the amazing women of color dancer choreographers, Emily Johnson, who is Yupik from the Alaska region, and Alice Shepard. And that will be an amazing conversation and artistic demonstration of both taking on both decolonization and greater accessibility of institutions. So please join us for those free events. You can register at fineartscenter.com. And I think that's it. And again, thank you, everyone, and good night.